So let us begin. We're at a very interesting part of the Tanya, because this is the part of Tanya that discusses things that happen to the neshama after a person passes away. And that's not common. It's not the kind of thing that you would expect to find in Tanya. It's not one of the areas that Tanya focuses on. Tanya focuses much more on what we're supposed to be doing while we're in this world, and the discussion about what will happen to the neshama, even though it will pop in here and there along the way, is certainly not our primary focus. Our primary focus is, as the pasuk says, Hayoim la'asoisam. Today is here in order for us to get the job done. At the same time, though, this is a particular section of Tanya that speaks about things that happen to a person after the person passes away. And the reason that we're speaking about this is because we said that if a person engages with something which is klipa, something which is completely impure, doesn't matter that afterwards they try to redirect themselves. Let's say a person ate food that was not kosher. So that would be a classic example of a person engaging with something that is impure. And afterwards, the person turns around and says, well, actually, now that I have this food in my system, I want to use it to serve Hashem. I want to utilize the energy in a positive way. We say that's very noble and very nice, but unfortunately, it is ineffective, because the reality is, once something is treif, it is anchored, it is stuck, and the only way out, as we learned, is through teshuvah. But what we did say in this chapter is if a person eats, again using the example of food, if a person eats food that is kosher and then temporarily does not have the right intentions, but subsequently uses that food in order to serve Hashem. So let's say that you ate something just before the shir, and you didn't necessarily have in mind that the purpose of eating was in order to have the wherewithal and the energy to be able to follow the shir, but now you're in the shir, so you're actually using that energy. We say, great, now you've had the opportunity to elevate the food, but there was a short period during which that nutrition was being absorbed into the body without having this holy spiritual value associated with it. And so the body is going to require some kind of a cleansing process, and that is what we call chibut hakever. Chibut hakever is that the body has to decompose in order to free the neshama, because as long as the body is invested very much in the physical world, well, then the neshama is anchored to that, and the neshama does not have the opportunity to elevate itself in the way that it should. That's what got us into this conversation about things that happen to the neshama after a person passes away. That was a description of what happens to the body in order to release the neshama, but the truth is that we also spoke about something that happens to the neshama. The example that we used was, what happens if you have a person who has every excuse in the world, genuine excuse, not to engage in Torah study? The person is not capable. They're an am ha'aretz. They're a person who is considered to be an ignoramus. So as a result of that, they don't really engage in Torah study. Instead, they engage with what is called devarim b'telim, words which are meaningless. So we said, in that case, the neshama has to go through this experience called the kaf hakela, which is the so-called slingshot of heaven, or the slingshot of souls, or whatever you want to call it. And the objective over there is like to shake off the dirt that has been accumulated with all the nonsense that a person has spoken during the course of their life. So that gives us a very intriguing insight that when a person talks rubbish, that rubbish clings to them, literally like dust. Just, if a person had to walk through an area that is very dirty and dusty and hasn't been well looked after, so you might find afterwards that you have dust on your clothes or whatever the case, and you have to shake them out. Similar kind of thing happens to the neshama. Then we said that if a person speaks in a way that is negative, so not just meaningless prattle, but a person actually speaks in a negative way, dishonest speech, foul language, speaking lashon hora, etc., that's going to do more damage to the neshama. And the neshama won't just have this fine line of spiritual dust on it that has to be shaken out, but the neshama will actually have some kind of a stain or a blemish, and in order to fix that, well, then you've got to go to the dry cleaners. And that's what we call Gehenim. We said that Gehenim is a process that literally scorches off the negativity that has attached itself to the neshama. And maybe we didn't really speak about this last time, but really the process of Gehenim is a process effectively of shame. Because remember, most people think that when a soul passes away, they get two options. There's an up elevator and a down elevator. And depending on how a person behaves, either you get sent up or you get sent down. So up would be the so-called Gan Eden or heaven, or paradise, whichever particular term a person wants to use, and it conjures up whatever feelings and thoughts you have in your head. Angels and harps and halos and clouds or tropical islands. I don't know exactly what everybody thinks of when they think of Gan Eden, but either way, everybody thinks Gan Eden is up. And Gehenim, on the other hand, well, that's toast and the great spit and red devils and pitchforks and flames. And whatever your particular version of Gehenna is, everybody thinks that it is down. And that's a mistake, because if we're talking about a spiritual reality, then physical geography doesn't make any sense. They can't really be up or down. The Rambam speaks about this in his introduction to the fundamental principles of Torah. He speaks about the fact that in the spiritual realms, none of the experiences that we relate to in the physical are relevant. So there isn't such a concept as sitting, there's no concept as classical movement, and he says there's no up or down. So that's really important to us. So what then is Gan Eden versus Gehenna? What distinguishes between the two of them? Perhaps a better way to explain it is this. So let's say, for argument's sake, that a person was at university or at school, and they had a particular subject that they had to study for, and then they were going to be examined on that particular subject. Comes the time of the exam. Well, how you feel during the exam is one thing. That's the hayoim la'asosam. That's when you actually got to put in the effort. But what happens when you get the results back from the exam? That's actually where a person could either be living in heaven or the other place. Because if you get a result back from the exam and there's a nice big black A on the paper, you're living in heaven. And then you realize that all of the effort that you invested in learning for this exam and preparing for this exam was obviously worthwhile, and it feels really great to see the value and the product of your efforts. The same exam for another student in the same class at the same time could come back with a different number marked in red. Let's say it's an F marked in red, and the person has not done well at all. They haven't passed the subject. They have to redo the subject. Well, then that same person experiencing the same exam in the same room at the same time is actually living in hell. So in a similar vein, the distinction between Gan Eden and Gehenna is not a spatial distinction. It's not like one is up the stairs and one is down the chute. Some kind of spiritual version of snakes and ladders, right? It's that what happens while we're alive is we are tuned into a level of consciousness that is limited to the five senses. So if we can't see, hear, smell, taste, or touch it, as far as we're concerned, it doesn't really exist. What happens when a neshama is elevated into that realm, the post-physical life realm? Then what happens? Now the neshama becomes attuned to reality that you can't experience when you're in the physical body. So suddenly there's an awareness that the neshama was never, or that the human was never able to have before. And that awareness is effectively an awareness of truth. So in our world, we don't necessarily have an awareness of truth in all situations. We might have an awareness of truth in certain situations. We might even debate between ourselves what constitutes truth. But we certainly do not have a stark, overwhelming sense of truth, especially truth with a capital T. Now, what happens when a neshama is freed from the body, and now it doesn't only process the world through the five senses, it now opens its eyes and it can see what is real. So reflecting back on the person's life, the person is now seeing, on the one hand, the truth of every situation, and on the other hand, their experience of every situation. So, if my experience of life aligned with the truth, then I'm in Gan Eden. That's amazing. I have a life to look back at that was completely aligned with Hashem's intention. There cannot be anything more enriching and rewarding than knowing that I'm completely aligned with ultimate purpose, and that my whole life was completely aligned with ultimate purpose. That's fantastic. Whereas, if a person gets to that position of reality and sees this is truth, this is ultimate purpose, and contrasted with that is my life, that's bitterly painful and, most importantly for our conversation, shameful. Because when a person recognizes the potential that they didn't use, the opportunities that they squandered, the terrible missteps that they took in their lives, the overwhelming sentiment is shame. Shame burns. That's why we call Gehenna fiery. Not because anybody's getting roasted on the spit, but because to be in a reality where a person has to confront the shame of their lost opportunities is so intensely difficult. That's what we call Gehenna. So that's pretty much what we got up to so far. We've said that whenever the neshama attracts a stain, the only way to burn the stain off is with that sense of shame. It's not a punishment. It's not an infinite experience of discomfort or shame. It is a process that actually sears away the negativity that our neshama attracted. Tonight, we're going to learn about another dimension of Gehenna, which we started to touch on very briefly last time, about the concept of Gehenna freezing over. Now we're going to learn what that is and how a person engages or encounters or has to experience that kind of a Gehenna. And we're going to use that as the springboard for a very intriguing, possibly controversial topic, which is the spiritual perspective on secular studies. Now, most people, when they see that, think, what on earth are you talking about? Surely that's not even a conversation. Surely that's not even something to be concerned with or to explore. Well, we're about to discover that it's a lot more complex than what we think. So let's first discover this frozen version of Gehenna, and then we'll take it from there. I actually did not tell you the page number in the book. That's because I don't have the book in front of me. Let's grab a book and just give you a page reference, because I know some of you have the book in front of you. So we're in chapter 8, which puts us on page 34, and it's just over halfway down the page. The first word on the line is tum asoy, and we're starting just after the full stop, just after the period mark. Second last word on the line, if you're looking at the screen, it is the very last line that you can see in front of you right now. V'chein, likewise, if you have an individual who had the opportunity to study Torah, and we spoke about this, and we said, well, if you think about it in the context of our lives, this is a huge indictment, because we have a tremendous amount of free time on our hands, whether we're willing to admit it or not. One of the main reasons that we believe ourselves to be so busy is because of how we fill our free time with meaningless pursuits. But realistically, we have a tremendous amount of free time on our hands, plus we have the capacity. Remember, we said an Am Ha'aretz, somebody who does not have the mental capacity to be able to learn Torah, is technically excused from learning Torah, but we're not Amei Ha'aretz, because we have access to Torah, actually, whenever we choose. Access that is unprecedented. Just think about it. How much Torah is available to us in language that we can understand in a variety of media. So either you read a book, or you listen to an audio podcast, or download, or you watch a video, or an animation. There are just so many possibilities with teachers from all over the world. So if we have the time to watch a National Geographic documentary, or we have the time to watch a Netflix series, then we surely should have the time to learn Torah, right? So, let's say that you have somebody who has the time and opportunity to learn Torah, but they don't. Instead of learning Torah, the person does something meaningless. Unfortunately, I think every single one of us, if we had to look in the mirror, would see one of these individuals staring back at us, because we do waste a tremendous amount of time on meaningless pursuits, the kind of meaningless pursuits that were not even available in previous generations. Things like Netflix, YouTube, social media, etc., etc. So, what happens to somebody who does that, who could be learning Torah, but instead just whiles away their time? First thing the Alter Rebbe says is, Ein kaf hakela levadoi mo'il lenafshoi. Just having that slingshot experience of the neshama being literally thrown from one end of the heavens to the other, which we said is the equivalent of beating a blanket with a broom so that you get rid of the dust, that's not going to help this neshama. Right? Being flung around, as traumatic as that might be an experience for the neshama, it's not going to help this neshama. Lemorka ulezakha, in order to cleanse and to refine this neshama. Let's understand why not. Well, the reason is because what kind of a statement does a person make? And we already alluded to this in chapter 1, if you remember. In chapter 1, we said that a person who wastes time where they potentially could be learning Torah is called Devar Hashem Boza, is considered somebody who, so to speak, disgraces Hashem's word. And I know it sounds harsh, but just let's put it into an objective perspective for a second. Purely objectively, without taking this on personally, without generating any unnecessary Jewish guilt, just purely objectively, look at it this way. Right now, I could be learning God's Torah, divine, infinite wisdom that Hashem, in His tremendous compassion and kindness, decided to share with me. Or I could click on the link of some person who said to me, you have to watch this hilarious episode of whatever. So obviously we get it. Sometimes we're going to want to watch the episode because we're people and that's what we want. And instead we say, listen, God, let's just put you on hold. I'm going to do this other thing instead of learning Torah. So that is an affront to Hashem. Okay, somebody's asked an interesting question, and that is, does this apply equally to men and to women? Good question, because the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, which means that there's a requirement for a person to learn Torah in all of their free time, is, needless to say, a men's mitzvah. Why do I say that? Because it's a time-specific mitzvah, and any positive time-specific mitzvah, women are typically exempt from. I say typically because there are certain exceptions, right? For example, like Kiddush, on Shabbos, etc., Pesach. But generally speaking, if it's a positive mitzvah that has a specific time frame, then it is an obligation for men and not for women, which is true. However, when you start to look at it from the perspective of, am I capable of dedicating my time right now to doing what Hashem wants, which would be to learn Torah, even though I'm not necessarily obligated time-wise. Remember, women are obligated to learn Torah, they just don't have the same time-bound obligation of learning Torah. So if a person says, listen, I'm not going to learn Torah, instead I'm going to do X and Y, I really don't see why it would be of any real difference. Okay? Again, why are women exempt from time-bound mitzvahs? Because women have other responsibilities that override the necessity for those time-bound mitzvahs, like preparing, looking after the kids and education and running the home, etc., etc. But if a person is fiddling on WhatsApp, I don't know necessarily that exempts a woman from learning Torah under those circumstances. And again, bearing in mind that women are required to learn all of the halachic elements of Torah that are directly relevant in their lives. And the Rebbe made a big deal about the fact that women should always be learning as much Chassidus as possible, because anything that is esoteric generally speaks more to women even than it does to men. And so there's greater responsibility for women to participate. Okay, so it's an interesting question. This is not an halachic ruling, just a perspective that I think we should be thinking about. Okay, back to the objective analysis. So here's a person who has a choice. On the one hand, I could be learning Hashem's Torah, infinite divine wisdom that has been gifted to me, Matan Torah, the gift of Torah, on the one hand. On the other hand, let's just see what's on the cooking channel. So, how do you weigh up the two of them? Well, obviously, if a person is going to prioritize something absolutely meaningless over Hashem's Torah, that's not going to reflect in a good light. So therefore, rak oinshim chamurim, that neshama, after the person passes away, is going to have to endure much more difficult cleansing processes, which we call punishment. Now, the thing is that usually when you say the word oinesh, people have a very negative association, because the word oinesh means punishment. And obviously everybody's going to have a negative association with punishment, right? It's probably valuable for us to remember that punishment is only a bad thing if the intention is malicious. So if somebody's sadistic and they decide that they want to punish people for whatever reason, and unfortunately Jewish history has been filled with individuals who showed those sadistic tendencies towards us, well, obviously that's a bad thing. But let's say that a parent who, in the course of discipline of a child, has to use a punishment, or as they like to call it in today's world, a consequence. It's never a comfortable thing, or it's never something that a person would embrace, and yet at the same time it's not a bad thing. So to have that time out, or to be grounded, or to be denied an opportunity to do something fun is not necessarily bad. So when we say over here oinesh, we're not saying that Hashem is vindictive and trying to punish the person because how dare you disgrace my Torah and therefore X and Y is going to happen to you. Punishment over here means that there's a consequence. Because the person did something that was, so to speak, disrespectful to Hashem, you have to anticipate that the consequences are going to be severe consequences, and it's not just going to help to shake out the rug and get rid of the dust. So what happens to a neshama if the person compromised on time that they could have been learning Torah and instead used that time in a meaningless way? So there are 2 points that we're going to see. Point number one is that learning Torah is a positive mitzvah. So there'll be a common denominator to any positive mitzvah, meaning any time that a person should have done a mitzvah, but instead shirked that responsibility and did not do the mitzvah, there'll be a common response to that will apply to all neshamas for any type of ignoring a positive mitzvah. And then, in addition to that generic response to leaving out a mitzvah that you could have done, to ignoring a mitzvah, there is a specific response if that mitzvah happens to be Torah learning, as we're about to see. So let's first look at what the generic response is to a person not doing a mitzvah. So al bitul Torah, shemanishim al bitul Torah beprotus, there are some very specific consequences that are leveled against a person who wastes the time of learning Torah. Milevad oinesh hakloli, besides the generic consequence, lechol bitul mitzvahs asay machmas atzlos, that is applied to any person who skips the opportunity to do a mitzvah because they were simply too lazy to do so. That's a big word, right? Lazy means that it's not that the person had difficulty doing the mitzvah, that there was a particular obstacle, that there was maybe a financial issue around doing the mitzvah, or perhaps a health issue. Maybe the person wasn't up to doing the mitzvah. Let's say, for argument's sake, God forbid, a person is ill and they can't daven or learn Torah, they can't focus, whatever the case is, obviously they'd be excused. We're talking over here about atzlus, which means that the person had every reason to actually do the mitzvah, and yet they didn't get around to it. So for any positive mitzvah that a person could have done, but they just simply did not get themselves into gear, the response to that is begehenem shel sheleg kimevuor b'mokim acher. That would be the Gehenim of snow, which is explained elsewhere. So most people, when they hear the word Gehenim, or worse, that poor translation that people use for it, the word hell, which is not a good translation for Gehenim, but the imagery that pops up in the average person's mind when they hear Gehenim is imagery of fire, because that is the most common way in which we perceive Gehenim. And the reason for that is because the most common way we perceive Gehenim is a consequence for having done something illegal. That's usually how a person lands up in Gehenim. There's something that the Torah declares to be illegal, and this person ignores that and goes ahead and does it anyway. So the person deliberately breaks Shabbos, or steals, or speaks Lashon Hara about somebody else. So any one of those examples would be somebody who is proactively, so they have energy that they have invested in going against what Hashem wants. Energy is represented by heat. Right? Wherever there's energy, there's going to be heat. So somebody who is energetically, deliberately, consciously going against something that Hashem has said is pumping heat, passion into a particular behavior. Now, the halacha is that if you ever want to cleanse something, if you want to kasher something, the way you kasher it is keboiloi kach poltoi, which means however the non-kosher element got into this particular thing, you have to use the same methodology to get it out. Simple English. If I take a spoon and I dip the spoon into dairy ice cream, and then I discover, oh my, the spoon was actually a meat spoon. Well, it's cold, so therefore to kasher it, to cleanse it, all I need is something cold. It's relatively easy to be able to kasher it. This is not a halacha shir, so don't walk out of here with any practical application. It's just to understand how the thing works. If, let's say, I took a dairy spoon and used it to stir a pot of soup, now there's heat. And what kind of heat? Heat that is a boiling liquid. Well, then the way to kasher this is going to require the heat of a boiling liquid. So I'm going to take the spoon, I'm going to put it into this big boiling pot where there's much more water than spoon, and that's going to kasher it. And if the way in which something became non-kosher was with a dry, direct heat, let's say, for argument's sake, a spit, right? You've got something over the fire on a spit, or what we call in South Africa a braai, a barbecue. So if you want to kasher it, now you're going to need that same dry, hot, direct flame in order to be able to kasher it. Those are the rules of how you get rid of the spiritual contamination of non-kosher in things, in vessels, cutlery, pots, etc. It's not altogether different when it comes to getting rid of the contamination of spiritual infestation or spiritual corruption of the neshama. You've got to look at how the problem was created, and whatever caused that problem, that is what is going to help to mitigate the problem. That's why, for example, the Gemara tells us the story of Onkelos. I don't know if you know the story. Onkelos was an interesting personality. He was a Roman. his uncle was the emperor at the time, and Onkelos decided that he wanted to be Jewish. Now, you can only imagine that ruffled a few feathers back in Rome, and they wanted to knock him off, or at least bring him back to his senses. Well, neither one worked. They were unable to bring him back to his senses. In fact, to the contrary, Onkelos brought a whole lot of the soldiers into the fold. He converted them into Judaism, and eventually the Roman authorities backed off, and they decided they're not going to bother him anymore. Now, one of the things that prompted that enticed Onkelos to follow through on his wish to convert to Judaism is he got hold of some kind of a necromancer who called up some different spirits of dead people to describe their experience in the next world. And the way that their experience is described is possibly allegorical, but certainly represents how what was happening to their soul was a direct consequence of the way in which they sinned against God in this world. So that's how it works. It's always the way that the trouble is ingested, the way that the problem becomes part of the soul, is the same method that's going to be required to get the problem out of the soul. So anytime a person transgresses, that means Hashem says no, and the person says yes, the person is exhibiting the heat of rebellion, the heat of passion. Those are the reasons why people do things that they shouldn't, because it was in the heat of passion, or it was in the heat of resentment or rebellion against what Hashem wanted. So because the damage is generated through heat, the kind of Gehenna that is going to be used to expunge that damage is going to be the Gehenna of fire. There's going to be the heat, the searing shame of confronting truth versus how in fact the person behaved, and that's what's going to help to rehabilitate the neshama. On the other hand, if a person has the opportunity to do a mitzvah and they decline the opportunity, there's no passion in that. It's the opposite. There's apathy or laziness. Why does a person not put on tefillin in the morning, not eat matzah at the Seder, not shake a lulav, etc.? Why not? Well, they just couldn't be bothered. They just can't find the motivation, either emotionally, physically, or intellectually. I don't see why I should be doing this. It doesn't talk to me. So that is not a crime of passion. That's a dispassionate sin. Here the problem is the iciness of apathy, the frigid nature of laziness. So the response in Gehenna is the snow Gehenna. Now, the snow Gehenna is not some kind of a physical experience of being frozen and, having frostbitten fingers and toes. What it means is that the person will be stuck in a perpetual state of inaction. So think of it this way. Have you ever had one of those dreams where you try to run and you can't? Or you try to scream and no sound comes out? That is a little shtickle taste of the Gehenna of snow. The Gehenna of snow is the person wants to now do what Hashem expects of them. Because remember, Gehenna, like Gan Eden, is exposure to truth. So now the person sees the truth. That actually the most valuable thing I should have done in my life was grab every one of those opportunities to do a mitzvah. And I didn't. And now I realize that. So I want to grab the mitzvah. But I can't. There are no mitzvahs available in either Gan Eden or Gehenna. In the spiritual disembodied state of the soul, mitzvahs are theoretical. There is no tefillin, there is no matzah, there is no lulav. So here you've got the person who wishes to now do the mitzvah, but they're frozen, so to speak, in a situation, a set of circumstances that doesn't allow the opportunity to do the mitzvah. And that's terribly frustrating. And the sense of frustration becomes what rehabilitates the neshama. So in the fiery Gehenna, it's the sense of pain and shame that cleanses the neshama, and in the Gehenna of ice, of snow, it is the frustration that cleanses the neshama. Okay, now here's a great question, and I was kind of hoping somebody would ask this question because it's fascinating. It's slightly off topic, but it's important to address at this particular point in time. So, what are we talking about here? We're talking about a neshama leaving this world and going into a state which is either going to be called Gan Eden or one of the forms of Gehenna. Okay, we haven't spoken about how long that lasts, and it definitely is not an ongoing, infinite experience. That's one of the key differences between Jewish beliefs and other beliefs. There are other beliefs that speak about eternal damnation. We don't. We believe that the maximum period a neshama could be in a Gehenna state is for a year. That's why we only say Kaddish for 11 months, because Kaddish is, amongst other things, supposed to assist the soul on its journey, and we don't want to give the impression that this soul needs assistance for the full 12 months, i.e. that the person is in Gehenna. We'd rather say we're just doing Kaddish, to assist them, but they definitely did not get the maximum sentence. So the first thing to know is that Gehenna, generally speaking, is a relatively short-term experience. However, the question is, what about the notion that the soul comes back in another body to be cleansed? In other words, the principle of reincarnation, which could happen more than once to a soul. So how do we equate that principle with the principle of a soul going into Gehenna, or for that matter, Gan Eden? So where do the souls really go? Do the souls go do they body hop for the whole of history? Or do they get stuck in a Gehenna loop, or a Kafakela, or even a Gan Eden? Okay, really, really interesting question. So let's drill down into that question for a moment, because it's quite valuable to understand. It's something, by the way, that the Alter Rebbe is going to mention much, much later on in Tanya in a very different context. So to be valuable to know this information, because it's going to come back into play then as well. So what is the story of neshamas and soul journeys and reincarnations and all that kind of stuff? We do know that King Solomon tells us, Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam, that the soul is compared to a candle, and that's one of the reasons why we light a Yortzeit candle, and that's one of the reasons why we don't blow out candles, because people don't want to give the impression of blowing out a soul, etc. Why did King Solomon compare the neshama to a candle? Well, there are two key reasons that are spoken about in Hasidus. The one is that just like a candle, or fire generally, is always reaching upwards, it's always in an upward motion. In a similar vein, the neshama is always reaching upwards. Even while the person is alive, the neshama is not satisfied with simply being in the human space, but it's always reaching upwards and always wants to connect to something higher. It wants to connect to Hashem. That's one reason why we compare the soul to a candle. The other reason is because you can take a candle and you can light another candle, and the original flame is not diminished because you lit another candle. That's the beauty of a candle, is that it can generate new light without losing any of its original light. It can generate new warmth without losing any of its original warmth. That's the beauty of a candle. So when a person goes to the grave of a tzaddik, there's a specific collection of tehillim and prayers and passages from the Zohar that some people have the tradition to read. It's called the Meine Loshen. And in that section, there's a Kabbalistic piece that says that lifa'amim neshama min neshama ne'etzeles, that there are certain occasions where a soul will be ne'etzal from a soul. Now the word ne'etzal is a very unique word. It appears in the Torah when Hashem tells Moshe that he should appoint 70 elders to help lead the Jewish people. And then he says that you should, Moshe says to them, Va'atzalti min haruach, or Hashem says, Va'atzalti min haruach, I'm going to take some of your spirit and emanate it onto them as well. Now that word, ne'etzeles, or vayotzel min haruach, as the verse says, which comes from the word atzilus, by the way, which is a very lofty spiritual world. All of those words mean something that emanates, and when something emanates, nothing is lost from the original. So, for example, when a candle glows, the flame doesn't get smaller with every bit of radiation that glows out of it. If you take the candle and you light another candle, the original flame doesn't get any smaller because you've lit another candle. When we speak about the principle of reincarnation, the concept is neshama min neshama ne'etzeles, that effectively what happens is you've got an individual who lives their life. After their neshama returns to Shamayim, that neshama now ignites a new neshama, which is considered to be like an extension of it, or an emanation of the original neshama, and that is the reincarnated soul. That means that person is now going to live as an individual, separately from the soul that passed away. The soul that passed away is now in Gan Eden, or wherever it might be, but because it's ne'etzeles, because the one soul has given rise to the other soul, there is a connection between them, and so the journey of this new soul will also have an impact on the original soul that went to Gan Eden. So it's not soul one that goes up and then comes back down and then goes up and comes back down. It's rather that soul one goes up and ignites soul 1A that comes down, which comes up and then ignites soul 1B, and so it goes. And so you have 600,000 souls altogether, but each one of them emanates an untold amount of souls, and they all collaborate and all benefit from each other's growth. So we don't have to worry about a neshama being reincarnated versus the neshama being in Gan Eden or in Gehenna, because it actually is it's this emanation principle. Okay, so what happens when a person avoids doing a positive mitzvah that they should have done? They were frozen in space, so to speak. In other words, they didn't respond. They were inactive at a time that they were supposed to be proactive. And so that's what happens to the neshama. The neshama lands up being stuck in a state of perpetual inactivity when it really wishes that it could be proactive. And that's what helps to rehabilitate the soul. Now let's get to the part which I think everybody's going to find a little bit challenging and maybe even controversial. Sorry, one second before we do that. Another question. What about Korach's soul? Okay, there's an intriguing question. Why is it an intriguing question? Because we're told that Korach goes She'oila, right? And not only that, the verse tells us that Korach goes to She'oil, which is a synonym for Gehenna, although sometimes is used to express something that's a little bit more dramatic than Gehenna. So Korach's gone into this place of She'oil, and the implication is that it's a long-term, possibly even a forever thing. That's the implication. So we might argue, and it's possibly needs a little bit more research, but we might be able to argue that Korach is an exception to the rule, and there are certain individuals who are, so to speak, such rogue souls that they get stuck in some perpetual state of rehabilitation, and they're going to need somebody somewhere down the line to help them. I'll tell you an interesting story. So, in fact, there are a number of stories along similar lines, but a particular story. There was once an individual who arrived at, I believe it was the Alter Rebbe's yeshiva. It's a whole story. I'm not going to go through all the details, but basically, the short version of the story is this fellow was a very dramatic personality. What I mean by that is an very extreme personality. And on the one hand was a very quick learner, and on the other hand was a kind of very unstable personality. Long story short is, it emerged afterwards that the Alter Rebbe divulged that this person was the reincarnated soul of somebody who was called Elazar ben Dordaya, a very interesting story in the Gemara about a guy who sinned his whole life and then did teshuvah right at the end of his life. It was very dramatic, but he had all of these years that he had never actually lived appropriately. So even though his teshuvah was effective, he never had the opportunity to really fill in the gaps. And so the story was that this soul had come back various times through history and eventually was rehabilitated. And it feels the same way with Korach, that if you read the many, and there really are many talks that the Rebbe gave about Korach, you feel like the Rebbe is working with Korach's soul, to try and rehabilitate his soul. Because every time the Rebbe speaks about Korach, it's from a different angle to say, well, of course he was a bad person, and yet Moshe tried to save him. Yet his aspirations were good aspirations. He wanted to be a Kohen Gadol, even though they were misguided, but they were fundamentally good aspirations. Korach was a very lofty soul. You see that kind of language. And there are quite a number of places, I think, in the Torah where you see that kind of thing happen. And it's the great sages using the Torah as a tool to yank a neshama out of where it is stuck. So I would like to believe that that's what happened to Korach, that he might have been stuck for a very lengthy period of time, but was eventually drawn out. And was Korach one of the original 600,000 souls? I don't know if he was necessarily. I know that he was one of the 600,000 people, obviously, who was counted in the census of the Jewish people in the desert. That's not necessarily identical to being one of the original 600,000 souls. So it's possible that he was already a branch of a soul by the time he was Korach. Okay? Lots of intriguing information for us to research about souls and soul journeys and soul branches and all that kind of thing. What's relevant for our conversation is, like I said, Tanya, generally speaking, does not focus all that much on soul journeys. It focuses much more on what we should be doing in our lives in the here and now, because ultimately, as the Baal Shem Tov once said, if it were relevant for us to know who we had been in previous lives, then Hashem would have made that information available to us. The fact that the information is not available to us is an indication that the most important thing in our lives is to focus on what we should be doing right now, rather than trying to work out where we came from and possibly even where we're going. The Gemara tells a story about Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Now, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, bear in mind, was one of the greatest sages who ever lived. At this time of the year, we tend to learn about Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai because he was very involved in dealing with the Romans in the early stage of the siege of Jerusalem. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, we're told, is a person who studied Torah for 40 years and taught Torah for 40 years. So he was a very accomplished individual. He had some of the greatest students ever in history. And yet, the Gemara tells us that when Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was on his deathbed, he turned to his students and said, I don't know which direction they're going to take me after I pass away. And it's such a perturbing question. Here you're talking about somebody who undoubtedly was one of the greatest Jewish sages ever in history. How could he question where he was going after he passed away? It was obvious he was going to Gan Eden. And the answer the Rebbe explains is he wasn't unsure of where he was going. He was trying to explain to his students that up until that point in time, he died at the age of 120. Up until that point in time, he had never stopped to give thought to where he's going after his life, because it's not relevant. What's relevant is, what am I doing today? That's what's relevant. To put it into terms that we can all relate to, the last thing that you want is for a player on a sports team to spend the game watching the scoreboard. That's not what you should be. You've got to be focused on handling the ball and making sure that you either defend your team's position or attack the other team's position. So it's a similar kind of thing. We shouldn't really spend our time focused, what if, what happens, what precedes, what follows. As the Rambam says, you shouldn't be looking what happened before we got here, what happened after we got here. Our focus is supposed to be on what should we be doing right now. Hayoim la'asoisam. Today is a day, it's a gift, and it's an opportunity to do what Hashem wants. Okay, so where does that leave us? Well, we've got to have a conversation now about secular studies, because that's the next thing that the Alter Rebbe is going to speak about. The only thing is, I really don't think we have enough time to even begin that now, because it's one of those subjects. Yes, I know it's a cliffhanger again, and I know you always tell me that I do this, but I think it's one of those subjects that you can't really stuff it into 2 minutes and then expect that we're going to know what's going on. So I think let's reserve it for next time. It's an interesting conversation, because the brain is the most developed and most sensitive part of the human experience. It's the part of us that we have to be the most careful about. So, in other words, if a person had to go step on grapes, let's say you went to make wines, you started stepping on grapes and it turns out the wine was not kosher, how badly will your feet be affected? Not that badly. But if you put inappropriate things inside your brain, well, that's a little bit more dangerous, right? And so because of that, that's why we're going to have this conversation about what kind of knowledge is a Jewish person supposed to study, what is the impact of different kinds of knowledge on our minds and by extension on our neshamas. And so please God, that's what we'll do next week.